All right, I am Sam Duty, and this is Improving the Economy with Robotics in South Korea. So, we start by taking a look at the global GDP, or more specifically, the annual growth of GDP per capita globally. And so, this is the world GDP data as of 2019. And I chose to omit 2020 because the COVID outbreak forced I say a lot, but it's pretty much most countries' GDP to go into the negatives. As of 2019, Korea has had a positive GDP growth rate of 1.89%, which isn't too bad. I would say it's pretty average for a country their size and from what they produce. And this is very good compared to the rest of the world, including the US, which had a rate of 1.7. But it is also important to take into account the size of each country, hence why South Korea's rate is very high because their per capita is very high. And by the end of 2020, their rate had dropped down to negative 0.99%, which still is not bad, but you don't want your GDP rate in the negatives. So, all right. World GDP by emissions. So I just thought this was an interesting little tie-in. So these graphs show the countries with the highest GDP that should say based on their carbon emissions created. So what you'll notice here is that countries with the highest populations usually create the most emissions, though South Korea has a relatively small population compared to the rest of the world, and yet they produce more emissions per capita than even China, which is pretty surprising. I think these graphs are pretty interesting as they tie in another SDG that could possibly also be solved through robotics. All right, so drawing some conclusions here, it is pretty apparent that South Korea already has a pretty good GDP, though they're right now currently still recovering from the COVID outbreak and heavy quarantine. And this is one of the many areas that can be improved through robotics. And another big conclusion that can be drawn from these graphs is that most of the time emissions increase with GDP. And as more factories and manufacturing plants are created that cause these emissions, this is another problem that could be solved with robotics. And some of my proposed solutions here are robotics could be used more in factories. So if robotics were to be used more in factories, it would obviously improve production and have a positive effect on reducing carbon emissions as well. Robotics could be used more in food and retail. So if robotics were used more in everyday jobs like cashiers or cooks, this could improve overall sales as some of the processes would be completed much faster and much more efficiently by a robot than they would by a human. And lastly, robotics could be produced by South Korea just in general. And South Korea is one of the world leaders in robotics technology. And so by simply producing more robotic technology, possibly also made by other robots, then it would increase the country's GDP. And that's it.